The story of the 12 tribes does not begin with a nation. It begins inside a family, and not a peaceful one. Long before there was a kingdom, a temple, or a land fully held, there was a household shaped by promise and strain. Abraham had received a covenant, Isaac had carried it forward, and Jacob, the younger son who gained what belonged to his brother by deception, became the man through whom the tribal line would take visible form. The biblical text does not hide what sort of man Jacob was in his youth. He was clever, fearful, and often divided within himself. Later, after wrestling through the night near the Jabbok, he received the name Israel, a name tied to struggle, endurance, and divine encounter. The people who would come from him carried that tension in their history from the start. Jacob's family life was crowded with rivalry. He loved Rachel more than Leah. He served Laban for one bride and woke to find another. Servants were given as secondary wives. Children were born into a house where affection was uneven, where mothers competed, and where sons learned early that place and favor mattered. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin did not arrive in a settled world. They arrived in a house marked by hurt, memory, and quiet battles for recognition. Later Israelite identity would speak of these sons as tribal ancestors. But the first picture Scripture offers is personal, not political. These are brothers before they are tribes, and brothers do not always live as one. The birth order mattered in the ancient Near East. It shaped inheritance, authority, and expectation. Yet in Genesis, ordinary order is often overturned. The older does not always rule the younger. The chosen line moves in ways that unsettle custom. Reuben, firstborn of Leah, should have stood secure, yet he compromised himself. Simeon and Levi were fierce, but their violence at Shechem left a shadow over their future. Judah, flawed and at times morally compromised, slowly emerged into a more serious role. Joseph, son of the beloved Rachel, was lifted by Jacob's affection and separated by dreams that made his brothers feel small. Benjamin, the youngest, carried the memory of Rachel, who died in childbirth. Every one of these family details mattered. Tribal history did not grow out of abstract theology alone. It grew out of griefs, loyalties, humiliations, and moments that people remembered for generations. The world around them was also larger than the family drama. Canaan in the 2nd millennium BCE was not a single unified nation, but a land of towns, local rulers, trade routes, and shifting influence from greater powers such as Egypt. Families like Jacob's moved through a landscape where pasture, water, alliance, and kinship determined survival. Altars marked sacred memory. Wells marked conflict and negotiation. Burial places mattered because they tied a wandering family to a promised future. When Genesis lingers over land purchases and graves, it is not wasting time. It is showing how promise was anchored in place, even before possession was secure. The sons of Jacob were not equal in character, and their later tribal destinies reflected that uneven beginning. Genesis 49 preserves Jacob's final words over his sons. And those words sound less like sentimental blessings than like a sober reading of character and consequence. Reuben is unstable. Simeon and Levi are rebuked for violence. Judah is linked to leadership and the language of rule. Joseph is described with unusual fruitfulness and strength. These sayings are poetic, old, and layered. They are not simple blueprints, but later generations read them as windows into tribal destiny. The tribe was never only a biological extension of an ancestor. It was a memory shaped by story, by moral evaluation, and by covenant language. There is also a deeper pattern already visible. The family chosen to carry promise is not morally impressive. It is unstable, often self-wounding, and susceptible to the same fears found in every age. That is one reason the story has endured. It does not ask the listener to admire the ancestors without reserve. It asks the listener to watch what becomes of a people who are carried by a promise stronger than their own consistency. Israel's beginnings are not noble in the way empires narrate their own origins. There is no polished founding myth here. There are brothers who resent, parents who favor, women who grieve, and a patriarch who learns the hard way that the God who called his family is not controlled by family schemes. By the time the 12 sons stand together in memory, the shape of future Israel is already present in miniature. There will be closeness and fracture. There will be election without perfection. There will be conflict between what covenant asks and what appetite demands. The tribes will later camp around a sanctuary, march under banners, fight under judges, and inherit portions of land. But before any of that, they sit at the table of one Father, hearing the weight of words over their lives. The history of the tribes begins not with strength, but with exposure. That is important, because it means that everything which follows, from Egypt to exile, is carried by a tension between human instability and divine faithfulness. The family of Jacob is not a heroic origin. It is a truthful one. Chapter 2. If the household of Jacob gave Israel its first shape, the story of Joseph revealed how quickly that shape could break. Joseph's dreams suggested rule. His father's favor made the suggestion harder to bear. In a world where honor was guarded and inheritance was contested, the sight of a younger brother wearing visible signs of affection was not a small irritation. It was a threat to the balance of the house. Genesis describes the brothers' jealousy with painful restraint. They do not merely dislike Joseph. They strip him, lower him into a pit, and sell him away. The future tribes begin with an act of near fratricide. The son through whom preservation will come is first treated as disposable by the very men who will owe him their lives. That movement into Egypt matters on more than a personal level. Egypt was not just a foreign land. It was one of the great powers of the ancient world, organized, agricultural, bureaucratic, and centered on the Nile. For pastoral families from Canaan, Egypt could be both refuge and danger. It offered grain in famine, but also the risk of absorption into a stronger civilization. Joseph's rise within Egypt, from slave to prisoner to administrator, has the quality of providence in the biblical narrative. Yet it also reflects a real truth about empires. Capable outsiders could sometimes find a place within them, especially when crisis demanded skill. Joseph interprets dreams, manages storage, and becomes the instrument by which Egypt survives famine, and Jacob's family is drawn southward. The move to Goshen preserved the family for a time. It allowed them to remain somewhat distinct, living in a region suitable for their flocks, and somewhat apart from Egyptian social life. Genesis and Exodus both remember this distinction. Shepherds were not naturally integrated into the prestige structures of the Nile state. That social distance may have helped Israel endure as a separate people during the early generations, yet settlement also changed them. A family that had moved through Canaan as a clan now remained in one place long enough to multiply. Memory of the patriarchs continued, but the conditions of life became less nomadic and more settled. Time in Egypt was not a short episode. It was long enough for names to become tribes and for ancestors to become tradition. Scripture moves quickly across those generations, but the silence itself says something. Long years pass between Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers and the rise of a pharaoh who does not know Joseph. Historical details are not fully explained, and late readers have often tried to tie the oppression of Israel to particular Egyptian dynasties. Some proposals fit better than others, but certainty remains difficult. What matters for the biblical account is that a protected immigrant community became a demographic concern. They were numerous enough to be feared. In the logic of empire, a fruitful minority living in a strategic region could be treated as a threat in wartime. So labor was extracted from them, and fear became state policy. By then, the memory of Joseph's mercy had not erased the wound Joseph had suffered. That is worth noticing. Reconciliation in Genesis is real, but it does not suspend the burden of history. The brothers bow before the one they once cast away, and Joseph, weeping, tells them that what they meant for evil, God meant for good. Those words are often remembered as comfort, and they are that, but they also mark the strange moral texture of Israel's beginnings. Divine purpose does not excuse betrayal, it outlives it. The preservation of Jacob's house came through the sin of the brothers, not because their sin was good, but because providence was larger than their design. The family that entered Egypt did not yet understand what that land would become for them. It was a place of rescue and a place of bondage, a place where Israel would survive and nearly lose itself, a place remembered with both bread and bitterness. Later generations would look back and speak of 70 persons going down into Egypt. The number carried symbolic force as well as family memory. It suggested a small beginning, a seed. From that seed came a people too large to dismiss. Joseph's own sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, also complicate the picture in a way that later tribal history will keep. Jacob adopts them and grants them a place among his heirs. That means Joseph's legacy within Israel will be doubled. Instead of one tribe called Joseph holding land in the later allotments, his two sons will stand as tribal names. This matters because it preserves the number 12 in a way that works alongside the special role of Levi. Even in these family arrangements, the later architecture of Israel is already being formed. When Jacob dies, he insists that his body be carried back to Canaan. That request is more than sentiment. It is testimony that Egypt, for all its grain and security, is not the final home of the covenant family. The promise remains tied to another land. Burial becomes an act of hope. The bones of Joseph will later travel as well, carried out in the Exodus as a sign that even the dead await the fulfillment of the promise. In this way, the tribes learn, long before Sinai, that survival in exile is not the same as belonging. A people can prosper in a foreign land and still not be meant to remain there forever. Chapter 3, the opening of Exodus, is abrupt because history can be abrupt. Joseph is gone. His generation is gone. The court that once welcomed his wisdom is gone. What remains is a people remembered, not for service rendered, but for numbers feared. There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That sentence holds political amnesia and moral danger together. Empires often forget the debts that made them possible. The Israelites, fruitful and multiplying, became useful bodies first and suspicious bodies next. Brickmaking, store cities, labor quotas, and harsh supervision turned growth into a burden. The family of Jacob became an oppressed people before it became a free nation. The biblical narrative is interested not only in political oppression, but in how oppression invades memory. Pharaoh orders Hebrew sons exposed to death. The attack falls on the future. If the males are destroyed, the people's strength is reduced and their continuity broken. Yet the deliverance begins not in palaces, but in acts of quiet defiance by women. Midwives refuse the king's command. A mother hides her child. A sister watches the riverbank. Pharaoh's own daughter becomes part of the rescue. Moses enters the story, not as a born ruler, but as a threatened infant carried through the machinery of empire by a chain of small, courageous acts. That tone matters. Israel's freedom will come through mighty signs, but it begins with hidden resistance. Moses himself stands between worlds. Raised in Pharaoh's household, aware of Hebrews' suffering, marked by a rash act of violence, and then years of obscurity in Midian, he is not presented as a polished founder. He learns the desert before he leads through it. Midian, lying east and south of the Promised Land, was part of a wider network of pastoral peoples who knew the dryness and danger of the wilderness. There Moses married, kept flocks, and encountered God at the burning bush. The call at Horeb draws together covenant memory and present suffering. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has seen, heard, and remembered. In biblical language, remembrance is not mental recollection alone. It is covenant action. The contest with Pharaoh is not simply a clash of personalities. It is a struggle over lordship, labor, and sacred allegiance. Egypt presents itself as ordered, stable, and divine in its kingship. Exodus answers that claim with plagues that unravel the confidence of the state. Water, land, animals, health, weather, and light all become unstable. The narrative moves like judgment against false security. Whether each plague also echoes particular Egyptian deities is debated, and the text does not always make such identifications explicit, but it clearly presents the God of Israel as stronger than the powers that sustain imperial arrogance. The point is theological and political at once. Pharaoh is not ultimate. Passover becomes the turning point. It is not only a night of escape, but the creation of a ritual memory. Households eat in haste. Blood marks doors. The event will be recalled not as a private miracle, but as the beginning of Israel's calendar and identity. A slave people becomes a remembering people. In the ancient world, ritual meals linked communities to origins, loyalties, and gods. Passover anchors Israel's life in the conviction that liberation came by divine act, not military achievement. They did not conquer their way out of Egypt. They were brought out. The crossing of the sea, however one reconstructs the exact physical setting, stands in the biblical tradition as the moment when bondage becomes past tense. The waters that had once threatened Hebrew boys now become the path of Israel and the grave of Pharaoh's army. Miriam leads song. The people celebrate before they complain. That rhythm too is realistic. Freedom does not erase dependency. Once the song ends, thirst, hunger, fear, and distrust rise quickly in the wilderness. The Exodus story does not romanticize the newly free. It shows how difficult it is for a people shaped by bondage to live, as if liberation were real. At Sinai, the tribes become more than descendants of common ancestors. They are bound into covenant. Law is given in a landscape where there is no settled king, no urban temple, and no inherited routine except the fresh memory of rescue. That setting matters. Israel's identity is formed in the wilderness, between rescue and inheritance, before land can make them comfortable. Covenant there addresses every layer of life: worship, rest, property, justice, sexuality, debt, leadership, sacrifice, and social care. It orders time with Sabbaths and festivals. It places holiness at the center, not as private piety, but as the shape of communal existence before God. The wilderness generation also learns how fragile covenant life can be. The golden calf episode comes almost immediately after Revelation. The people ask for visible gods. Aaron yields, Moses intercedes, judgment falls, mercy remains. If the tribes are to survive, they will do so not because they are naturally faithful, but because the covenant includes both command and forgiveness. From this point on, Israel's history will repeatedly turn on that tension. The Exodus forged them into a people. Sinai told them what kind of people they were meant to become. Their later history will show how hard that calling was to sustain. Chapter 4 in the wilderness. Israel was arranged before it was settled. That arrangement mattered because it gave visible form to a people who might otherwise have dissolved into a crowd. The Book of Numbers preserves lists, censuses, marching orders, and camp positions that can seem distant to modern ears. Yet they reveal something essential. Israel did not think of itself as an accidental mass wandering between crises. It was ordered around the presence of God. The tabernacle stood at the center. Around it camped the Levites, and beyond them the tribes in designated groupings. East, south, west, and north all had their assigned standard. This was not merely military administration. It was theology made spatial in the ancient Near East. The arrangement of camp and sanctuary reflected hierarchy, access, and identity. To know where one stood was to know both privilege and obligation. Israel's tribal camp embodied a truth the law had already declared. The people belonged to God, yet not all roles were the same. Levi did not receive land in the same way other tribes would later receive land, because Levi was set apart for priestly and sanctuary service. That did not make the Levites wealthier or more powerful in every practical sense. It made them dependent on the gifts and faithfulness of the wider community. Their inheritance was tied to sacred service. In that way, Israel's structure reminded the people that worship could not be separated from everyday order. The number 12, so fixed in memory, is slightly more complex in practice than it first appears. Joseph's line divides into Ephraim and Manasseh, while Levi's sacred role changes how inheritance is counted. This is why lists of tribes in the Bible are not always identical. Different contexts emphasize different functions. Landholding, military service, genealogy, or symbolic completeness. Later readers sometimes become uneasy when the lists shift, but the shifts themselves show that tribal identity was living, not mechanical. Israel was not preserving an abstract diagram. It was remembering a people through several overlapping lenses. The wilderness years were also years of testing. The people were no longer under Egyptian masters, but they had not yet become settled cultivators in their own land. Life in desert space teaches dependence with a severity few settled societies understand. Water sources determine movement. Food cannot be assumed. Threats come not only from enemies but from heat, distance, and discouragement. The wilderness generation murmured often, because freedom does not cancel fear. Manna and quail, the striking of the rock, the bronze serpent, the rebellions of Korah and others, all reveal a nation learning that covenant is not sustained by enthusiasm alone. It requires trust under pressure. This setting also shaped how the tribes viewed one another. They marched under separate standards, retained ancestral identities, and counted fighting men by tribe. Yet they were asked to move as one body. Numbers 1 and 2 sound administrative, but beneath them lies a recurring tension that will mark the later centuries. How can tribes remain distinct without becoming divided? How can local identity serve common purpose rather than undermine it? In the wilderness, Moses and Aaron hold the center by divine commission. Once they are gone, the difficulty will sharpen. The failure at Kadesh Barnea casts a long shadow over all this order. When spies return from Canaan, the land is described as fruitful, yet its fortified cities and formidable inhabitants terrify the people. Only Caleb and Joshua urge trust. The rest of the community recoils. The result is judgment. The generation that left Egypt will largely not enter the land. This moment matters because it shows that tribal organization alone cannot create courage. Israel can have banners, priesthood, law, and sacred memory, yet still refuse the costly obedience required by covenant. The wilderness becomes a grave for one generation and a schooling ground for the next. When Moses nears death, he knows the people stand on a threshold. Deuteronomy, though framed as a series of speeches, functions like covenant renewal for a new generation. Memory is rehearsed, laws are restated. Blessing and curse are set before the people with unusual clarity. They are told that life in the land will bring temptations unknown in the desert, abundance, forgetfulness, and the seduction of neighboring cults. This warning is historically important. Israel's greatest danger in Canaan will not only be military defeat. It will be assimilation, the slow acceptance of other gods, other political imaginations, and other moral loyalties. The wilderness period ends then, not with triumph but with preparation mixed with warning. A slave people has become a covenant people. A family memory has become a tribal structure. A sanctuary stands among them. A priesthood serves. A law has been given, yet none of this guarantees future faithfulness. The later histories will show that Israel often remembered Egypt more clearly than Sinai, and often desired the security of surrounding nations more than the demands of its own covenant. Still, this wilderness order left a lasting mark. Even after kingdom, exile, and return, the idea that Israel was a people gathered around the holy presence of God remained one of its deepest memories. Chapter 5. The entry into Canaan is one of the most difficult and important transitions in the biblical story. Under Joshua, Israel crossed the Jordan and began to take possession of a land long tied to promise. Yet the biblical account itself presents this process with more complexity than a quick reading sometimes assumes. Joshua contains sweeping scenes of victory and decisive battles. Judges preserves memories of incomplete settlement, local resistance, and coexistence with remaining populations. Historically, the emergence of Israel in the highlands likely involved a mixture of conquest, collapse of older city-state structures, infiltration, local alliances, and gradual consolidation. The Bible is not giving a modern military report. It is narrating, in theological terms, how a promised inheritance became a contested reality. Jericho and Ai stand near the beginning of that memory, not only as battles but as moral lessons. Jericho falls through ritual obedience rather than conventional siegecraft. Ai falls after failure has first exposed hidden sin within Israel's camp. The message is plain. Possession of the land depends not only on strength but on covenant fidelity. Achan's theft turns private greed into communal defeat. That theme will never disappear from tribal history. Israel's future is shaped as much by its internal moral condition as by the power of external enemies. The land itself was diverse. The coastal plain, the central hill country, the Jordan Valley, the Jezreel, the Negev, and the Transjordan each posed different opportunities and pressures. Canaanite urban centers often sat in strategic locations and were linked to trade routes. Highland settlement offered defensibility, but also demanded hard agricultural labor. When the tribal allotments are later described, they are not arbitrary districts on a blank map. They are environments that shaped behavior. Ephraim and Manasseh occupied significant central regions. Judah held broad southern territory. Asher faced the northern coast. Naphtali and Zebulun lay in the Galilean north. Issachar worked fertile areas exposed to stronger neighbors. Benjamin sat in the tense corridor between north and south. Geography would later influence politics, trade, and vulnerability. The tribes east of the Jordan, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh reveal another layer of complexity. Their choice to settle in Transjordan reflected real pastoral needs, especially for livestock, but it also raised concerns about solidarity. Would distance weaken their bond with the tribes west of the river? Joshua 22 preserves a striking memory of how quickly suspicion could arise when an altar was built near the Jordan. What turned out to be a witness to shared faith nearly became the cause of civil war. From an early stage, the tribal confederation was learning that symbolic actions around worship and territory carried immense political weight. The land was divided by lot, a practice that placed distribution under divine oversight, rather than pure negotiation. Yet the results also reflected history and character. Judah's territory was large. Simeon's inheritance lay within Judah's and was eventually absorbed. Levi received towns rather than a territorial bloc. Joseph's house was strong enough to be represented by Ephraim and Manasseh. These allotments shaped later prominence. Some tribes held borderlands, others held central roots. Some enjoyed agricultural advantage, others lived with chronic exposure. Tribal identity was never only ancestry. It was also the life pattern formed by a particular landscape. Joshua's covenant ceremony at Shechem is especially important because Shechem was both geographically central and historically charged. It lay near older patriarchal memories and became a place where the people were summoned to choose whom they would serve. That scene, with tribes gathered to renew commitment, reminds the listener that conquest alone was not the heart of the matter. The land had meaning because it was the stage of covenant life. To inhabit it while serving other gods would be a contradiction. Joshua's final words press that concern with unusual force. The people answer bravely, but later history shows how difficult their answer was to maintain. It is also worth noting that the Bible does not portray Israel as entering an empty land. They arrive among peoples with their own traditions, shrines, economies, and claims. Later, moral discomfort about conquest is understandable. and the ancient text itself frames the matter in terms of judgment, covenant, and the danger of religious corruption rather than ethnic superiority. Israel is repeatedly told that its own tenure in the land is conditional. If it adopts the same injustices and idolatries, it too will be removed. That warning eventually proves true. By the end of Joshua, the tribes possess a land, but not yet a stable national coherence. They have ancestral portions, sacred memories, and renewed. Yet what binds them is still fragile. There is no permanent central king. There is no large standing bureaucracy. There is a sanctuary and a law, but the daily life of each tribe is locally grounded. What comes next will reveal how hard it is for a people to remain one when each tribe returns to its own hills, valleys, and concerns. Chapter 6. The period of the Judges is often remembered for its dramatic personalities, but the deeper story is the weakness of the tribal confederation. Israel is in the land, yet not fully at rest. There is no enduring monarchy and no consistent national administration. Instead, there are local crises, regional oppressors, and charismatic deliverers raised for a time. The Book of Judges describes a recurring cycle. The people turn from the Lord, oppression follows, they cry out, and a judge arises. Yet the cycle is not a neat machine. It becomes darker as the book moves on. Disorder intensifies. The judges themselves are increasingly flawed. Tribal unity phrase. Deborah and Barak reveal what the confederation could be at its best, and what it often failed to be. Some tribes came to the battle. Others remained with their flocks, ships, or local comforts. The Song of Deborah remembers courage and hesitation side by side. It is one of the oldest poetic texts in the Bible, and its ancient tone preserves something raw about the era. Israel was not yet a seamless nation. Participation in the common struggle could not be assumed. Tribal choice mattered, and reluctance had moral weight. Gideon's story also exposes ambivalence. He defeats Midian not with imperial resources, but with a reduced force, so that the victory cannot be credited to numbers alone. Yet after the triumph, the people ask him to rule. He refuses the title of king, saying the Lord will rule over them. But then he fashions an ephod that becomes a snare. Even the deliverer can deepen confusion. The period teaches that charismatic leadership without stable faithfulness does not solve the deeper problem. It may rescue for a moment, but it cannot heal the heart of the people. Intertribal conflict becomes one of the grimmest features of these centuries. Jephthah's conflict with Ephraim leads to the infamous test at the Jordan, where pronunciation marks belonging and death. Shibboleth becomes a deadly border between Israelites. The brutality of that scene should not be softened. By then, the tribes are not merely struggling against outsiders, they are wounding one another. Language, accent, and regional identity become markers of suspicion. This is what happens when common covenant memory weakens and local pride hardens. The closing chapters of Judges are even more devastating. The violence at Gibeah and the war against Benjamin expose a society almost unable to govern its own passions. Israel punishes one tribe so severely that it then scrambles to preserve that tribe from extinction. The story is morally chaotic because the period itself was morally chaotic. The repeated refrain. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes is not just political commentary. It is an assessment of a people unable to restrain violence when covenant order collapses. Yet even that refrain should not be read too simplistically. The problem is not solved merely by installing a king. Later kings will prove that monarchy can centralize sin as easily as it can restrain disorder. Still, the era shows why the desire for stable leadership became so strong. Historically, this was a time when the highland tribes lived among stronger neighbors and changing regional pressures. The Philistines on the coastal plain were especially formidable, with military organization and technological advantages that made them unlike many of the looser local powers Israel had previously faced. Ammonites, Moabites, Midianites, and others pressed at different times from different directions. The tribal system could respond, but unevenly. It was good at producing local resilience. It was poor at sustaining long-term unity. Religion during this period was also unstable. Local shrines, household idols, and mixed worship appear repeatedly. The tabernacle and priesthood remained part of Israel's sacred structure, yet the practical religious life of many communities was porous. Canaanite fertility religion, local cult objects, and family-based devotions competed with covenant worship. That is why the Judges period feels spiritually confused. The issue is not abstract unbelief, it is divided loyalty. Israel rarely abandons the Lord by formally denying him. More often it adds rivals, compromises, and substitutes. Yet even within this dark age, there are signs that tribal memory and covenant identity endure. The story of Ruth, set in the time of the Judges, offers a quieter counterpoint. There famine, migration, loyalty, and redemption unfold, not through military deliverance but through family faithfulness. The line that leads to David is preserved in ordinary acts of kindness and legal responsibility. That contrast matters. Even in disorder, the future of Israel is not lost. It is carried through remnant faithfulness in households, fields, and covenants kept without spectacle. By the end of Judges, the tribes still exist, the land is still theirs in principle, and the covenant still defines them in theory. But the confederation is exhausted. The need for a center, military, political, and sacred, has become undeniable. The question is whether the people seek that center as a way of submitting more deeply to God, or as a way of becoming like the nations around them. The answer, as the next stage shows, is mixed from the beginning. Chapter 7, when Israel asked for a king in the days of Samuel, the request grew out of real fears. The aging of Samuel, the corruption of his sons, and the pressure of external enemies made the old system feel inadequate. Yet the request was not neutral. Like all the nations lay behind it. That phrase reveals the tension. A monarchy could bring needed coherence, but it could also reshape Israel's imagination in the image of surrounding states. Samuel's warning was clear. Kings take sons, daughters, fields, and produce. Central rule creates both protection and burden. The people still asked. And Saul, a Benjaminite, was chosen. Saul's tribe matters. Benjamin had been nearly destroyed in the days of the Judges. Yet from that smallest and wounded tribe came Israel's first king. This is consistent with the strange reversals found throughout the earlier narrative. Saul looked the part. He was tall, militarily capable, and able to rally the tribes in moments of crisis. His early victories gave Israel breathing room, but his reign exposed a fault that would define the tragedy of many leaders after him. Impatience before God, followed by self-protective pride. He offered sacrifice when he should have waited. He preserved what should have been devoted to destruction. He built a kingship that increasingly turned inward, suspicious, unstable, and threatened by comparison. David, from Judah, enters Saul's story first as a court musician, then as a warrior, and finally as a rival in the king's imagination. The transition from Saul to David is more than a change of rulers. It marks a shift in Israel's center of gravity. Judah, already significant in ancestral blessing traditions, becomes the royal tribe. Yet David is not introduced as an uncomplicated hero. The narrative preserves both his courage and his failures. He defeats Goliath not with royal weaponry, but with trust and skill. He survives as a fugitive, learning wilderness politics, tribal alliances, and the cost of restraint. He refuses to seize the throne by killing Saul when opportunity comes. That refusal is central to his image. He receives kingship through timing he does not fully control. David's unification of the kingdom was one of the decisive moments in tribal history. He first ruled Judah from Hebron, then gained recognition from the northern tribes and captured Jerusalem. The choice of Jerusalem was politically brilliant and theologically fertile. It was not the old center of any major tribe in the way that Shechem or Hebron had been. It sat near the border between Judah and Benjamin, and could function as a royal city not wholly identified with one tribal past. By bringing the ark there, David joined kingship and sacred memory in one place. Jerusalem became more than a capital. It became the symbolic heart of Israel's united life. The covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7 gave Judah's role lasting significance. God's promise of an enduring house did not mean every Davidic king would be righteous or secure, regardless of conduct. It did mean that the royal line would carry a distinctive covenant weight. This is one reason Judah later survives longer than the north in the biblical interpretation of history. The Davidic promise becomes an anchor, not a guarantee against judgment, but a thread that will not be cut. David's reign, however, was not pure golden age. He expanded territory and established relative strength, but he also committed grave sin in the matter of Bathsheba and Uriah. The consequence entered his house. Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah turned the royal family into a theater of ambition and grief. The old pattern from Jacob's house had not disappeared. The tribes were now one kingdom, yet the king's family showed the same dangerous mixture of desire, favoritism, and violence. National stability did not erase human corruption. It gave it a larger stage. Still, David accomplished what the Judges period could not. He gave the tribes a shared court, a central capital, and a stronger military coherence. He also deepened the liturgical and poetic life of Israel. Psalms associated with his name gave language to trust, repentance, lament, kingship, and covenant longing. Even where later editorial shaping is involved, David's memory became inseparable from Israel's worship. The tribes were not only politically gathered, they were given a voice that could bring scattered lives before God in prayer. When David died, the United Kingdom stood stronger than ever before. Yet its future was already uncertain. Succession remained dangerous. Tribal memory had not vanished beneath royal identity. The North and South were united, but not fused. Jerusalem was central, but not equally loved by all. The monarchy had created possibilities the Confederation lacked, yet it had also concentrated taxes, power, and grievance. The next reign would display the glory of centralization. It would also prepare the conditions of division. Chapter 8 Solomon inherited what David had built and turned it into visible splendor. Under him, the kingdom reached a level of wealth, prestige, and international connection that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Trade networks expanded. Diplomatic marriages multiplied. Administrative districts were organized. Building projects transformed the landscape. The temple rose in Jerusalem as a permanent house for the name of the Lord, replacing the movable tabernacle of the wilderness age. In biblical memory, Solomon's reign stands at the height of Israel's united monarchy, a time when wisdom, order, and magnificence seemed to gather in one man's court. The temple was the crown of that achievement, built with cedar from Lebanon, skilled labor from Tyre, and wealth amassed through royal power. It gave the covenant faith a fixed architectural center unlike anything that had existed before. Its design drew from wider Near East patterns of sacred architecture, yet its function within Israel was distinct. It was not a residence for an idol. The ark remained central to its symbolism, and the invisible God of Israel was not represented by a carved image in the inner sanctuary. This absence mattered deeply. The temple declared both nearness and transcendence. God chose to place his name there, yet he could not be contained by a building. Solomon himself acknowledged that in his prayer of dedication. At the same time, temple glory cannot be separated from royal burden. Massive building requires labor, taxation, and administrative extraction. 1 Kings carefully preserves the names of officials, the scale of provisions, and the reach of Solomon's system. Such details are not neutral decoration. They show how tribal society was being transformed into a centralized state. Traditional tribal structures did not disappear overnight, but royal administration often bypassed them. Solomon's district system appears to have ignored old tribal boundaries in some places. That may have improved efficiency, yet it also loosened older loyalties and created new resentments, especially outside Judah. The northern tribes had reason to feel the weight of royal policy. Corvée labor, the conscription of workers for state projects, was common in ancient kingdoms, but it pressed hardest on those who could least afford absence from their own fields and households. A glorious court in Jerusalem could look very different from a village in Ephraim. The tribal confederation once struggled because it lacked a center. Now the kingdom would struggle because the center demanded too much. History often moves that way. The cure for one weakness creates the conditions for another. Solomon's wisdom tradition also deserves careful reading. Biblical texts remember him as a man of extraordinary discernment, and later literature associated him with Proverbs, reflection on life, and the ordering of knowledge. Yet scripture also describes his decline with unusual sadness. Foreign wives brought foreign cults into proximity with the royal court. High places rose for gods not named in Israel's covenant. This is not simply a private moral failure. In the ancient world, royal marriages were political alliances, and alliances carried ritual expectations. The king who built the temple also opened the door to rival worship. That contradiction lies at the heart of his legacy. Economically, Solomon's reign likely intensified social stratification. Court culture, international trade, and monumental architecture create prestige, but they also draw resources upward. The biblical narrative does not provide a modern economic analysis. Yet the complaint later brought to Rehoboam is plain. "Your father made our yoke heavy." That sentence interprets Solomon from below. It reminds the listener that glory seen from the palace may feel like burden in the countryside. The temple itself would outlive Solomon as a symbol far greater than the man who built it. Pilgrimage, sacrifice, priestly service, festival gathering, and royal memory all converged there. Jerusalem became, more than ever, the sacred center of Israel's life. But this centralization also sharpened the fault line between north and south. If a political break ever came, worship would become part of the crisis. A kingdom divided could not share a single sacred center without tension. Solomon's death left behind a powerful but delicate structure. The tribes had been drawn into one state, yet their old histories had not been erased. Ephraim still remembered its strength. Judah still held the royal house. Benjamin remained tied to Jerusalem's orbit. The northern territories carried the heaviest memory of labor demands. The temple stood in the south. The court was Davidic. The question was whether wisdom would guide succession with humility. Instead, pride would turn complaint into fracture. The united monarchy reached its peak under Solomon, but its internal trust had already thinned. Splendor concealed exhaustion. Once the king was gone, the old tribal map would reappear with startling force.